About 3 years ago, Mobius had the enormous privilege to start partnering with colleagues at Egon Zehnder to create a quite unique executive breakthrough program based on Erica's Winning from Within model. And we've been leading that program for future CEOs and senior executives of Fortune 500 companies now for over 100 very visionary, future-minded leaders. And one of the key faculty members and partners in crime that we've enjoyed collaborating with, co-creating with, and envisioning a new world with is my dear brother, Ricardo Sunderland. And I really have the privilege to ask Ricardo to introduce our afternoon's wonderful speaker, our friend Linda Hill. So welcome, Ricardo.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you.
He has too many sisters here. Uh-oh, we're not going to ask about the favorites.
I thought you were my sister.
I know. Oh, I know. This is a problem. Okay.
I've been discovered.
You've been discovered, yeah.
Yes. As you can imagine, I'm Mexican. So
that explains it all.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for being here. It is truly an honor to be able to introduce Linda in the Next Practice Institute. Linda is the Wallace Brett Dunham Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. She is the faculty chair of the Leadership Initiative and has chaired numerous Harvard executive education programs. Linda is within the dean's inner circle of advisors who help them figure out what is it that Harvard will be teaching 3 years from today. And I already know by looking at Linda that she's starting to feel uncomfortable by this introduction.
Yes. Yes.
Linda is a very curious anthropologist, a warm, grounded person, combined with a unique insight and critical thinking. She is a wonderful woman, a caring mother, and one of the most sought-after leaders of innovation in the world. I just don't know how you do it, but you do. And on that front, I am really honored to be able to call you partner and friend.
Yeah, thank you.
As a result of 10 years of research, Linda identified patterns of leaders who've successfully been able to create cultures of sustainable innovation, or as you refer to as new and useful things.
Yes.
And recently published the bestseller book, Collective Genius, where through storytelling, she's sharing with us a framework that allows for leaders in a simple and nimble way to understand the leadership challenges and complexities to create cultures of sustainable innovation at their organizations. She's also the co-author of Being the Boss, 3 Imperatives of Becoming a Great Leader, which, oops, this is following me. Which was named one of the 5 best business books to read for your career. Linda consults and teaches in areas of leadership innovation, talent management, leading change and innovation, implementing global strategies, and managing cross-organizational relationships. It's a pleasure to introduce you, Linda. The floor is yours.
Thank
Thank you.
Well, that is so kind of you. I'm not going to get close. Oh, I have a cold. All right. So you're okay? Well, that was very kind of you. I first want to apologize. I'm standing in front of you, a rather damaged individual, but we're going to do the best that we can do. I was in Sweden last Monday, and a child knocked me down. He was ready to get off the plane, so I left my crutches at home because I'm not going to be around here with crutches with you all. It just feels too strange. So I am moving a little slowly, and then I think I have both allergies and a cold, so I'm not hearing as well as I should, and my voice is probably just a tad deeper than it normally is, but the brain is working, okay? But I have this okay, I'm getting old, I know that. And if you heard the introduction, the kind introduction, part of my problem is I'm too curious about everything. But just to let you know, I'm somewhat more of a generalist than a specialist, and I am an ethnographer. So I do use the methods of anthropology to do my own work. And the work I'm going to be describing to you has really been done with a lot of collaborators. There's nothing, if I say I'm actually, I'm wrong. It's always we, and it's not a royal we. They're really sort of a team of people that I have been doing work with over the time of my career. And I actually do work in 3 areas, and I'm going to be focusing on the work on innovation today, but my other work is on how people learn to lead. And the second piece that I study is really how do you build global organizations, or how do you build organizations that can implement a global strategy. So a fair amount of my work is in emerging markets as well, because that's where a lot of the growth is happening. And the final piece is on innovation, and that's what we're going to be focusing on here, but I'm only one person, and all of these things kind of come together as I'm thinking about them. This is designed to be, I do have things to tell you, and I will talk at you if you let me, but feel free to ask me questions, and it should be interactive, and we have until 4:15 is my understanding. So along the way, just ask me whatever you'd like to ask, or make an observation about whatever you'd like to make an observation about. And if I'm going to really talk about it a little later, I might say, why don't we wait on that one? But if you don't want to, all you have to say is, no, I don't want to wait, let's do it now. So I'm feeling quite flexible. Just speak up so I can make sure I'm hearing what you're saying properly, and we'll move along that way. So what I'd like to do is actually share with you the work that we have been doing on collective genius. And it's now been over 10 years. And in fact, when we wrote the book, we had studied at that point 16 individual leaders. But now we've studied about 33, depending on how you count, 33 to 35. Not that people aren't whole people, but we're not done some of these studies, just starting to do some other ones as well. And so it is research that we continue to do. And I will tell you, I'm going to talk about the work that we first did in trying to understand the connection between leadership and innovation. Because as it turns out, the academy is very siloed, like maybe many of your organizations. The people who study leadership are actually quite separate from the people who study innovation. And the dean asked me a question, because one of my responsibilities is to think about, are we helping people learn what they need to learn? And he said, Linda, all of our stakeholders are coming and saying to us they need to be better at innovation. Are we doing what we need to do to make sure that they're good at innovation? And because I am an academic and truly an introvert, I went to the library where I love to spend my time. That is who I am. And I looked at the books, and obviously I have Clay Christensen and Michael Tushman and other people on my hallway, and talked to them about it, only to realize that we actually had not done much work looking at the connection between the two. And that is really what we've been focusing on, and that's the work I want to share with you. Just to tell you where the work is going, and I don't completely know this, but one thing that we're also looking at now is boards and innovation. So how does a board, what role does a board play in helping a management team be innovative or not? And so we're collecting data on that. The other piece is we're looking a lot at ecosystems and how you build the ecosystems necessary to get the innovation done you want to do. And companies are building ecosystems with other private partners, sometimes with competitors, sometimes with government. So that's the other piece of the puzzle we're looking at. And the final piece that we're sort of doing a little bit on is we're looking at accelerators. And I think in part because just with the ecosystem work, trying to understand what are the different kinds of tools or systems that organizations are relying on to try to be more innovative. So I have a little bit of that stuff in my head as well, but we're not done that work by any means. But I will be happy to speak with you about what I think we're seeing there, if any of that interests you in particular. I will talk about one or two of the people that we have studied to look at ecosystems, but the board work I don't really intend to spend too much time on right now, because in some ways we're kind of still analyzing the data, although we are beginning to develop a point of view. So what I actually first did, and this has been my role as being the head of the leadership initiative at the school, is periodically I am supposed to go around the world and survey C-suite executives about what it takes to really lead in their organizations. And one of the things we've been hearing for a long time now, but it's getting even louder, is that leadership has always been hard, but it's actually getting harder, because it is indeed harder for organizations to sustain success in today's economy. And so one of the studies we did is we went around the world and asked people, what does it take to be a high potential in your organization today, and what did it take 10 years ago? So 10 years ago we were told, and 10 years ago was arbitrary, we were told that if you were a value creator in an organization, you could be a high potential. But now, if you want to be a high potential, it's not enough to be a value creator. You must also be able to be a game changer. And a value creator is someone who knows how to identify and close what is referred to as a performance gap. If any of you read the innovation literature, like Tushman or Clay, they talk about these performance gaps. A performance gap is a gap between where you are now and where you should be. A game changer is someone who knows how to identify and close what is referred to as an opportunity gap. That is a gap between where you are now and where you could be. And so what we were being told by these executives is, yes, we need people who can identify and close performance gaps. We need value creators. And guess what? That's not easy to do. And you all know that because you're trying to do that in your own organizations. But what we also really, really need, what we're desperate for, are people who can be game changers, who know how to identify and close these opportunity gaps, who are working on what we could be doing, not just on what we should be doing. So with regard to this could be doing piece of the puzzle, for sure, if you're going to lead an organization to close an opportunity gap, you're going to have to be involved in either leading change or leading innovation. And one thing I am going to say, and I'll say it time and again, is that leading change and leading innovation are two separate tasks. They're related, but they're different. Now, you may also have to lead change and lead innovation to close a performance gap. But that may not be necessary. It may simply be an execution task. Again, a very difficult task nonetheless, but a different kind of deal. So what we begin to try to understand is if we need more and more individuals who know how to close these opportunity gaps, and we need people who know how to lead change, and we've known that for a long time. We now need people who also know how to lead innovation. And as I said, when I went to look in the library, I realized we didn't actually have a lot of research on what that meant to lead innovation. Then we need to be preparing leaders, and what I went back and told the dean at that time is, I don't know that we're doing all we need to do about the leading innovation piece, because we don't know a lot about it, even though we know a lot about the leading change piece. So I found myself, if you will, having to do the research myself to answer the question that I'd been asked in my role. So that's partly how it happened that I began to look at this. But I've always, always, always been interested in innovation. And to some extent, I guess you would say creativity. And I'm going to be kind of loose with some of these words, although I will become more precise. So the very, very first case that I did at Harvard Business School was a case about the woman who was working with Michael Jackson on how to do the moonwalk, because I've always been interested in genius, okay? It's not because I like to have fun. That is a piece of the puzzle. But I really have always been interested truly in genius. So when I talk about collective genius, we're going to come to something else. So I understand the importance of talent. And I learned a ton from her. And actually, in writing the acknowledgments for the book, I acknowledged her, because she did teach me about how do you work with a Michael Jackson to help him be his best self. And that is where I started. Now, when I came back and told people at the school this is what I was going to do, they were quite concerned about whether this little individual was going to be a successful professor at Harvard Business School, right? Because all I was talking about, guess who I got to sit next to? Smokey Robinson. This is a good job, okay? Now, I'm happy to stay. I'm still there. I still do things like that, things that make my heart beat fast. But what I want to say about that is, it really did impress me to understand what she told me about how she thought about creating the space for this man who's obviously very talented to do his best work, and that the space that you create around him really matters if he's going to be able to do that. Now, the reason my colleagues were worried, and I'm not picking on them, but they truly did say this, entertainment is not business, Linda. I was like, oh yeah? I think it is. But anyway, that's how different I started at the school. I guess now we're trying to figure it out. I think it was 32 years ago. But in a way, entertainment wasn't business. If you think about what we studied, what we did, and what were the kinds of companies we wanted to look at, you know, Michael Jackson wasn't the story. If you look at what's actually happening now, obviously it is business, and it might be actually where the US has a competitive advantage for those of us who are from the US trying to figure out how we're going to move forward. So I've always spent, one part of my head has always been, I have had always a consulting practice with people who are very talented who've been trying to express that talent, whether they were entertainers or they were technologists or scientists. So that's one piece of the puzzle. So this kind of goes back more than 10 years in some ways in thinking about some of these questions. The other people that I also spend my time with are people who are interested in social problems. And the person that I've been most blessed to spend some time with by complete accident, and the other person that I actually did acknowledge when we wrote this book, was Nelson Mandela and people who were with him trying to do, anti-apartheid movement. So on the other end, here's another genius, very special. And guess what? The way and the people that told me about him and how he did things, very similar to what Suzanne taught me about working with Michael Jackson. So I have these different interests. I became a business professor because I'm interested in economic development. So fundamentally, the Nelson Mandela piece is the piece that gets my heart really beating fast, but I also love to fool around and figure out how do you help Michael Jackson learn to do the moonwalk, right? So those may not be your companies, and obviously they're not necessarily, but all in between I'm also interested in, because the issue of how we all get the best work out of people to solve the problems that we see in the world or to address the opportunities, that's what gets me up in the morning. And so the research I want to talk with you about is work that I'm actually quite passionate about, that I've looked at in a whole range of contexts and for a very long time. So really, to be very precise here though, how do we prepare leaders who know how to identify and close both performance gaps and opportunity gaps, particularly those game changers, because they become so important in our being able to sustain success today is what drives this conversation we're mostly going to have. But these other things are back there in the back of my head and keep me excited about life. So, what do exceptional leaders of innovation do? This was the question that we began to look at. And the way we define exceptional is that these are individuals who have built teams, business units, organizations that could innovate more than once, that can actually routinely innovate. So that piece of the puzzle, that is how we defined an exceptional leader of innovation. Someone who built something, some group, that could do it time and again. And I put it in the context of telling you, on the one end you have, if you will, our Michael Jacksons, our Nelson Mandelas, but most of us are not Michael Jackson or Nelson Mandela, and we're living in different kinds of organizations, and I'm going to describe a whole range of kinds of organizations in between, if you will, where you still see this routine kind of innovation and what we mean by that. So I do study globalization. Very important to me that we not simply study people who are from the US. So we are looking at leaders in a range of different countries, and we're still collecting data. Latin America is looking a little empty there. We're beginning to do some work in Brazil. We've done a little bit of work there anyway. For this study, obviously do other work there, but just to give you a feel for the countries that we've worked in. And I do want to say now, before I forget, that what I'm going to describe to you are the commonalities in what we saw with regard to these leaders. But there were differences. There were commonalities in what they did and why, but there were differences in how they did it. And those differences reflected either their national culture, their own particular organizational culture in a way, their industry, or even their own leadership styles, because they all had different approaches. But I'm going to talk about the commonalities. We also looked at individuals in a whole range of industries. We began to look also at government and the not-for-profit sector because of some of the nature of some of the kinds of issues that we've begun to look at. And I will tell you that the individuals we've looked at, only 2 of them are in R&D. The others are all line executives or in corporate roles. So a general counsel at a pharmaceutical company, CEOs, we'll talk about them, the head of sales and marketing. So these are all people, none of them who specifically are, if you will, are in the innovation piece of their particular organization, except for 2. Actually were R&D leaders. And interestingly enough, and I don't know if this is a good or a bad thing, it might make you nervous about me, we didn't notice we didn't have any R&D people until fairly late in the study. And it's like, we have no R&D people. So we better find some. So we did do that. And yes?
Why did you exclude some metals mining companies and other companies like this?
Why did we exclude them?
Yeah.
I don't know that we excluded them specifically. I don't know that that was the intention. We did do some manufacturing companies. I don't know that we don't have any mining, I would say.
Metals?
Metals. So there's a family business that they're not one that I've studied, but it's one that I'm consulting to. There's a family business that is in metals and mining in Latin America that I have been doing some work with that are trying to be more innovative. They actually are trying to transform their culture to be that way. But I don't know that it wasn't excluded. It's more that I'm an ethnographer, and I do have a family, and so to travel around and collect these data were already complex enough. What's your worry?
Just one question in advance, whether we can just extrapolate the answers to this question.
To a mining company?
Yeah, mining company or metals company.
I don't, you know what, I don't have data about that. The one organization I'm working with now has part of what they're doing is in the space you're talking about, and there's no reason why it wouldn't necessarily be relevant. These companies still have to execute, and we define innovation very broadly, so there's no reason why not, but I can't tell you that I've studied it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Yep. I have done work with, I've actually have 2 clients that are in the mining business, and we haven't studied them in any kind of specific way. If you can always give us your examples, give us names of exceptional leaders of innovation, and we'll go look at them. So going back to this, the way we define innovation, there's no reason why it wouldn't be very relevant to mining. So in terms of innovation, we use a very inclusive definition of innovation. And innovation for us is something that is both new and useful. So if it's new or creative, that's fine, but if it's not useful, it's not an innovation. Now, I will tell you that the organizations and this definition does not necessarily fit all the definitions that people have out there, because for us, an innovation can be either everyday or it can be breakthrough. And the reason why we adopted this definition is this is the definition our leaders adopted. They had a very democratic notion of innovation, that everybody in the organization had the capacity to innovate. And because of that, some of it's going to be more everyday and some of it's going to be more breakthrough, like when you think about the kinds of people I talked about when we started. Now, the other thing is it can be a product, a service. It can be a business model. It can be a way of reducing costs. It can be a way of organizing. And again, they adopted very broad definitions. And I think part of it is one of the leaders told us it took them, for instance, at Pixar, one of the organizations we studied, it took them 20 years to create the first full-length computer-generated movie. Now, to build a company that you only have an innovation every 20 years is a little weird, right? So that's not very helpful. Now, they obviously had other innovations along the way to get there. So they don't really get caught up in, I guess they're not, it doesn't matter. If it's new and useful, it's an innovation. That's fine. So again, there's no reason why it wouldn't be quite relevant in that context. So how many of you actually recognize this man? Some of you think yes. Now, interestingly enough, this man, even if I show his picture in Silicon Valley, and I'll never understand this, they do not recognize who he is. But you all do recognize his children, right? So Ed is the founder of Pixar. And it is interesting, I guess he was surrounded by two big personalities, John Lasseter and Steve Jobs, and maybe Ed, maybe he doesn't stick out as much as the other two. But he is the secret sauce of Pixar. He is the founder of the company. And in fact, one of the things, one of my co-authors didn't really have this title exactly because they don't have these titles, but he was basically the chief technology officer of Pixar. He worked with Steve Jobs at Next, and when he bought Pixar, he asked Greg to go over and help scale it. And Greg stayed there doing that for 13 years. And then when they were acquired by Disney Animation, he went over to help with that integration. So he's one of the people that we work with still today to collect data. In fact, I've already had 3 or 4 emails from him, even though he's out on the West Coast. Had them very early this morning. And he introduced me to Ed. So Ed has been someone that I would encourage you all to read his book and anything you can read about Ed, because he is an unbelievable man. And one of the things I should say about Ed, he's actually quite flexible in his capacity as a leader. Not only, if you will, could he build Pixar, he also was a part of the team that turned around Disney Animation. So for those of you who have, Frozen dolls, et cetera, in your home, you can blame it on Ed. Mm-hmm. So Ed is someone who actually can operate, he's very versatile in his leadership. So again, a man who, there's so much that we can learn from him, and let me just tell you a little bit about Ed. So these are some of his children that you may know. And one of the things, when I first went to Pixar, and actually Greg took me there, someone drew a picture for me to help me understand how you make a movie. And one of the things that you see here, which was most important, is they kept talking about the fact that making a movie is a team sport. And they do not believe in a free agent model, which is mostly what Hollywood, they think that that's partly why Hollywood's not so successful. And we're going to come back to this idea that they get that innovation, making a movie, this is a team sport. So they drew this picture for me, and they reminded me that it takes 250 to sometimes 400 people 4 to 5 years to make one of these movies. And they cost like $1 billion to make. And needless to say, that's not one individual, that's more collective genius, going back to what it does take to get one of these things done. And they do have a process that they go through, and it looks like this, or they can put these little boxes there, but they immediately begin to draw all these lines and, to help me understand how messy and iterative the process really is. So what they say at Pixar is that nothing is finished in the movie until the whole movie wraps. So everything is obviously always being worked on, and they never know how long it's going to take to get something done. And so if you all remember the monster in Monsters, Inc., who kind of has hair like mine, I think someone got an Academy Award for that. It's very difficult to do my hair, right? So, and it's very difficult to do the hair of the girl, and hair's difficult. In Incredibles, where she swings, someone definitely, her head, that is really, really hard. And actually, it was very funny when I first went to Google to talk to them, because they were part of our study, one of the leaders was, the person, they said, did you touch the person who did, Sully's hair? I said, did I touch him? Don't know that I touched him, but I talked to him. Next time I go, I'm going to touch him, so I can tell you that. But they described to me how this one woman, actually, Marissa was one of the people, she stayed up all night to try to figure out the problem of how you could do that. And it took them a long time to figure that out. So they never know what's going to be difficult when they start a movie, or the shadows under the cars. Very, very difficult to get those right. So that's technically a difficult problem, and artistically it was a difficult problem. So they never know. Some things take months, some things take weeks. But the other piece of the puzzle, one of the animators described to us how he had come up with an idea about how a particular character should look. And he showed his pictures, his drawings to the director and said, how about this? And the director said, that is beautifully done, but it's not how I see the character, so lose it. And he said, of course, that feels terrible. You've worked on it. It takes them 6 months to perfect about 10 seconds of film, right? So they're hurt too. Their souls are in whatever that is, but the director doesn't see it that way. So I guess you could say it was creative, it was beautiful, but it wasn't useful, so it wasn't innovation. They didn't need it for that. But a few weeks later, the director came back and said, where are those moments? Where is that? And he showed it to the director, and the director said, let me, I see what you're getting at. Let me have those pieces of film. Let me have that. So what they say when that happens at Pixar is because that animator was able to share his slice of genius with the director had a more nuanced sense of who that character was, and therefore the story got better. So this issue of slices of genius, the new, how do you get that? And then how do you make it useful, is really the tension or the paradox that has to be managed at the heart of any innovation. You got to get the new, but that's not enough. You got to see if it's going to be useful. So in this instance, it was useful. So what we do know about all innovations is that, what we don't know all about innovations, let me say it differently. What we do know about innovation is that most innovations are not the result of some genius having an aha moment. And many of you who look at innovation know this or try to innovate. It really is the case that most innovation is the result of a journey, a collaboration, a kind of problem solving, people working together to try to work on whatever it might be, to get a solution to something. And usually that group of people that you need to get the innovation done is diverse in some ways. They have diverse expertise, diverse points of view. The other thing we know about an innovation is most innovations are the result of discovery-driven learning. You cannot plan to innovate. You have to act your way to an innovation. So you're going to have missteps, you're going to have failures. The third thing we know is that most innovations are not completely new. They're often old ideas applied to new situations or different combinations of old ideas to make a new idea, or whatever it might be. And the final thing we know about innovation is that even though most of us enjoy or think we enjoy doing innovative work, it's actually very hard work. It can be exhilarating, but it's also very scary work. It's very difficult work. And that is the reality of what we've always known about what innovative work is about. So the question becomes, if that's what it's all about, what is the leadership of it about? Now, what we do see in many organizations is we have all the talent. We want to get the talent together, the diverse talent, the top talent, whatever it might be, to be able to work on some innovative issue or some issue for some topic about which we need an innovative solution. Now, the challenge is you do need the talent, which is actually why I told you a little bit about my initial passions. Talent matters a lot. However, we all know talented groups of people who've not innovated, right? We've all gone to really, really bad movies, for instance, right? Despite the amount of talent that was there to sort of work on that movie. So one of the things that often happens when we're trying to understand why didn't that group work out or what happened there is that people will say there were just too many cooks in the kitchen. Do you all know that terminology? In almost any language, any country I go to, we all have that phrase of too many cooks in the kitchen. Now, the one thing that Ed would tell you is you can never have too many cooks in the kitchen. You always want to have too many cooks in the kitchen. Like, do you want me to fire one of my Academy Award-winning directors? I don't think so, right? I need to learn how to cook. Help those people learn how to cook together to make a really special meal. So you want to have too many cooks in the kitchen. Now, how do you get them to cook together? That is the trick here. And that's what we've ended up looking at. So in fact, what we see about organizations that can innovate time and again, what the leaders do is they have actually developed in their organizations 3 capabilities. And let me walk you through these 3 capabilities. But is there any question or comment that anyone wants to make? Are we good? Oh, okay. So the three capabilities: creative abrasion, creative agility, and creative resolution. Let me just quickly describe them to you. And again, these are things that we knew about innovation, right? If you read the research on what it takes to innovate, we're looking at the connections amongst these things with leadership. So these leaders create organizations that first can do creative abrasion. This is a capability of the organization. And what it's about is that actually you can create a marketplace of ideas through debate and discourse. And it is a marketplace. It is a competition. So for sure, many of us in our organizations, when we're starting to try to do something innovative or do some kind of problem solving, we often will go through a brainstorming session where basically there's no abrasion. You just say whatever you're thinking, no one's going to evaluate it, etc. Well, yes, you might go through that process, but eventually you have to evaluate. There has to be a competition of the ideas. There has to be an abrasion of those ideas to actually get a robust marketplace, a robust pipeline of ideas. So what you see in these organizations is they actually amplify difference. They don't minimize it. Because those differences are the resource you're relying on to actually come up with a solution. So they amplify them. So they do have debate, and it's heated, but it's constructive because they get that you rarely get innovation without diversity and conflict. They are essential ingredients to most innovation happening. So that's what creative abrasion is about. So we actually have developed an assessment tool to help you to figure out whether you have these capabilities, but I'm just taking one question here. So if you think about it, we have the diversity of perspectives we need to do our work effectively. This is the kind do you have a diversity of perspectives? Now, some organizations have no diversity of perspective, right? And a diversity of perspective is different than demographic diversity. Demographic diversity may indeed relate to whether you have a diversity of ideas or diverse points of view. But if you don't have the diversity, you already are behind, if you will, in trying to create this marketplace of ideas and this capability. But just because you have the diversity, it doesn't mean that you know how to work with that diversity by any means. And in fact, what you have to see here is, can you actually debate and use that diversity constructively to figure out and create this pipeline of ideas? And so that's what creative abrasion is about. Creative agility is really about, did you see that moved? If Greg was here doing this with you, everything would move, okay? He is he's from an animation company. So this slide, we have some that are animated. Please report to him that I animated some things. He gets very disturbed. I'm not really much of a PowerPoint person in general, but anyway, that one moves. And this is about being able to be agile. And this is the whole idea that you have to test the ideas. So once you have your marketplace of ideas and you want to figure out what the alternatives are and to test them, and it's sort of like design thinking in a way. I understand why that's become so popular, this combination of science and art, to actually be able to test an idea, get feedback on that idea, and then refine the idea. And this is the capability. And as many of you know, when you're testing ideas, there are more or less good experiments and bad experiments, then these companies know how to do that properly. But they also pay attention to the feedback they get. Right? When it comes back that, no, the customer doesn't care for it so much, or whatever it might be, they actually pay attention to that and don't insist. They try another experiment, and they can make those adjustments as well. So this is what creative agility is about. And so what we see here, actually, using the word experiment is an important piece of the puzzle. These organizations do know how to do experiments. So one organization actually said to us, we no longer do pilots. Because if you do a pilot and it doesn't work, then someone is wrong or something is wrong. And there's a lot of politics around it. But when you do an experiment, and as long as you learn from that experiment, that's fine. That's what needs to happen. So that's the kind of orientation they have about this particular capability. And just a couple of questions. We routinely try out new ways of doing things. This is very basic. Do you actually do any experimenting? Do you try things? Lots of other questions you could ask to look at it. Do you actually pay attention to the feedback, et cetera? But we are just beginning to look at, this would be an example of basically a fundamental that relates to creative agility. But this is the other thing. If something doesn't work, can we make adjustments? How agile are we? Can we do that? And one of the things I guess I should say that we never really said explicitly, which we probably should have, is that these organizations are, if you will, customer-centric. Because of this creative agility piece and the fact that they do test these ideas out with whomever they're going to be, whatever the problem is, whatever the audience is, they tend to design things that are solutions that really meet the needs of whoever that customer is, because that's how they're doing it, through this creative agility. The other thing that's a little bit slippery, and I can't say this with complete conviction, but I think because they do it this way, these organizations appear to be better at execution as well. They're not only good at innovation, they execute better, because this is how they come up with solutions, by working and testing them out with whomever it is that they're trying to develop that solution for, or whatever, whoever who's going to be using whatever they're up to. So the final one is this creative resolution one. And this is about how they do decision making. So the thing that I first have to say about creative resolution is that these organizations were very clear about who had decision making rights. There's clarity about who gets to make the decision. No one's confused about that. But having said that, they have a very patient and inclusive way of making decisions, so that people can be included. They get the points of view of lots of people, and they let it sit long enough, if you will, for them to be able to combine things. Because fundamentally what you see in these organizations, and the reason why we said they do integrated decision making, is we actually are more likely to see the kind of thing that Roger Martin talks about, where you get opposable ideas brought together. So what you see is, because they do have this more patient and inclusive way of doing things in their process of making decisions, they don't allow one group to dominate. So they don't allow the bosses to dominate. Right? If you just let the bosses dominate, you're not going to get both and. You're not going to get combinations. You're going to get what the boss thinks. They also don't allow the experts to dominate. And the experts are a very important group to pay attention to when you're innovating, because the experts can be the people who are most resistant to trying an innovation, frankly. So they don't let the experts do it either. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't want the experts in the room, because you do, going back to too many cooks in the kitchen. You want people who are really good at what they do. But they really are more patient, so that they work through, and I'll give you some examples of this, with, between the bosses and the people who aren't the bosses, the experts and the ones with the naive eye. They have a process of doing decision making so that you bring those perspectives together. So that's the last kind of capability. So this has a lot of ideas in it, but this is sort of what we hear, that decisions get made here, the right people are involved in the right way. So it's always clear to people who should make the decision and who's going to do it, but it moves around. It depends on what it is that we're working on, who really should be the person, if you will, making that particular decision. And it's not necessarily going to follow the expert line or the hierarchy. It's going to go where it needs to go. So I will give you, this is the other one, they do not compromise just to get along. So this is something that many companies find themselves falling into, this kind of pattern, or organizations, that we just compromise. As you all know, compromise rarely leads to innovation. But so many organizations, you get tired of it, you just say, okay. Right? They will not do that. They don't let groups dominate, and they also do not compromise. They are going to fight. Now, one of the challenges I want to bring up, and one of the things we need to think about with our leaders, if you think about Pixar and you have these different directors, and this is, in somewhat, you can imagine who those directors are. These are people who are passionate about their ideas. So they are not compromisers. Right? They're not. So when Ed talks about you need to be able to, you've got to help these cooks learn to cook, they're passionate and they're very opinionated. And you as a leader need to be able to work through that with them to get to a decision that makes sense. Now, if you are the director of a particular movie, everybody knows in the end you're going to make the call, because you're the one who's the director. If they decide over time you're not listening, they will replace you as a director, and another director will be there to make those decisions. But as long as you are the director of that particular movie, it is your right to make the decision. Yes, sir?
Who organizes or who orchestrates the process?
Usually these leaders, actually, one of the things we see about them on Ed or whomever it is, they set up the processes. They tend to. So Ed is actually, I guess there's 3 people who ran that company as sort of the CEO. Sometimes we're looking at people who are more middle managers. But again, they orchestrated it. But that doesn't mean that they'd be the ones who'd make the decision, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yep. Yes.
I have 2 questions actually. First one, how to learn to be an innovative leader?
Yeah. Can I get to that in a minute?
Yeah.
After I tell, yeah.
The second one probably is will also follow.
Yeah.
If we seed some innovation system into organization,
Yeah.
how do we preserve it from the influence from
All the
outside?
others, just that one too. Going to give you a couple of things to illustrate that a bit.
You guys hold questions just to the end. Linda's agreed to stay and answer some questions.
Oh, okay. You want to know? Okay. Yes. Did you?
Super quickly.
Oh, yeah.
Compromise
Yes.
requires standards.
Right.
So there's obviously a tension between too many cooks, lots of opinions, but who's the standard holder? Who's the person that defines that we will not compromise?
That we will not compromise? Well, actually, the group won't allow it. So let me come back to it. I mean, basically, if you start to compromise, I'm going to say to you, excuse me, are you compromising? Do you really believe that? We develop norms, which is where I want to go. So these are the capabilities. So let me answer these two questions. No, seriously, right? The leader will do that, but other people will also do it. That's a big piece of the puzzle. So let me just actually, let me talk about this man first, and then I will answer. I do have examples of both of these to get to that. So this is Bill. I'm only going to call people by their first names, and you do know Bill, even though you don't know Bill. And one of the things I loved about Bill was the senior vice president of engineering for Google from the time, he was employee 10 or 11. So he came, quote, out of retirement because he knew a lot about scaling websites, but he didn't know how to scale at the pace that they were going to need to scale to do what Google wanted to get done. And that excited him, because I've never done it that way, right? Let's figure this out. Now, I was so happy to meet him because, as you see, he is not young playing volleyball, right? And this is not to be mean about Bill. But anyway, the thing about Bill is, and one of the things that was very interesting, we went to this group, and this is the part of Google I know. I do not know the rest of Google. So when I start talking about a leader, about a particular piece of the organization, there was one we studied for hundreds of hours, a lot of time. It was this man. And one of the things that you'll see, although I think it's here, is everybody who ran this group, they either had no hair or gray hair. Google did not fool around when they built the website. And that is one of the most robust websites we've ever seen. We also studied eBay from the day Meg Whitman became the CEO of it for 10 years. They had all kinds of technical problems, partly because the technology wasn't as good, but also because they didn't approach it the same way. This is the guy who built out that website. And Bill's considered to be one of the very best leaders in Silicon Valley. Now, when we met Bill, he was working with YouTube. Now, if I had known, I now have a 14-year-old. If I had known what YouTube would mean to me in my life, I would not have wished him well, okay? Who knew what YouTube was, right? No, it was a mess. It was impossible to store. It was horrible. And this is what they were trying to figure out what to do. I mean, what's YouTube? Who's going to watch YouTube? This is when we first started working with them. So I used to go out to see Bill because we needed to collect data, and I teach, so I had to go when I had some days off. I would go and maybe nothing was happening, and this was very frustrating to me. And Bill would say to me, Linda, we have to wait and see what's going to happen spontaneously. I'm like, spontaneously, Bill? It needs to happen while I'm on break. No, no, spontaneously. So what did that mean? What it meant was literally what he said. He said, okay, we have this YouTube thing. I'm going to wait and see. And he had 1,000 engineers in his group at this point. He said, I'm going to wait and see what ideas come up about what to do about YouTube. So finally, 2 ideas came up spontaneously, and 2 groups emerged with 2 very different points of view about how to store the data of YouTube. So he said, these are both interesting. I'm just going to have to let him go at it. Well, it took him, he had no idea, it took them 2 years working at breakneck speed, this is their language, to come up with a solution of how to store the data of YouTube. And they had really, really good people, right? It was really, really hard, going back to the difficulties associated with trying to innovate. And so he literally let these 2 groups emerge. And what he was very happy about is that engineers apparently have been educated in different ways. So you have built-in diversity in how they think about problem solving because you have different generations. This is what he told me anyway in there. And what he did is they all build prototypes. And he had them, as he said, bump those prototypes up against reality and discover for themselves the strengths and weaknesses of their particular approach. And this was a 2-year process. They were working very, very fast and very hard to get this done. I just want to be clear about this. So finally, after about 2 years, they needed to get a solution because things were getting a little wobbly. It was a problem. So they had to pick. And what he said at that point, Linda, we cannot afford to lose the learning of either one of these groups. These groups are expensive. We've got to make sure. I need to be a social architect, and I need to make sure that the group whose solution doesn't get selected actually gets adopted by the group that's working on the next big thing. and that learning gets passed on. So he spent a number of months, he and his leadership team, making sure that the group who looked like it wasn't going to get their solution adopted for the website, but they would be adopted, and they would very easily move in to work with the next group that was working on the next problem, because there was another problem with storage, because they were doing other things. And that's what he spent his time doing, orchestrating that whole adoption process. And once they were there, their learning got utilized, and no one even noticed. Now, the engineers were complaining bitterly about the fact that he was doing this, because fundamentally what he was doing was two parallel experiments, right? Because they had a shortage of engineering talent. And they were also just, why doesn't he just tell them what to do, right? He said, never tell them. So Bill is a man, when I asked him what advice should I give MBAs if they want to be effective leaders, what did he say to me? Never hire someone who will not argue with you when you're interviewing them. I said, this will make me very credible, Bill. He said, if they won't argue with you at the interview, they're not going to argue with you later. This is how you get creative abrasion, why you don't get compromise, right? If you aren't going to argue, he said, you got to be able to argue. You must have a point of view about something. It's interesting. This is what this man said. And this, again, this is the website. This is not some, this is all got to work. So what he did, though, he said, and what one of the engineers said to me, you know what, I used to think Bill was kind of nutty, but I'm beginning to understand now what he's up to. If he had put those two groups together, they would not have focused on what's the best answer. This goes to the standard piece. What's the best answer for Google at this time? They would have been focused on who's right and who's wrong, because they had two very different points of view. If three groups emerge, he never goes beyond three, but he'll let three do. He's a social architect. He pays attention to, are they going to be able to be together or not? And occasionally he would bump them up against each other. He knew they were peeping anyway to see what the other group was doing, because they wanted to know, and right. He knows that's all happening. But he pays attention to where the fault lines might end up being, and if there's going to be one, he doesn't put them together. Let them play it out separately. He said, many people think this is inefficient. No, it is not. What you do is you do sequential experiments. You do one group, they don't get it done, you put another group in place. It's more efficient to do the two, and frankly, when you're really trying to innovate, most of it's not going to work. So why not do a few experiments? Because you must have an answer by X date. So he thought this was very efficient. Now, interestingly, when we look at this, they were very capable of these things. What we saw in our leaders, and just to summarize, and I'm trying to give you a sense of how Ed, and to some extent, how Bill thinks, they were all visionaries. Every leader we studied was a visionary, probably with a big V. And I think it may be because of how we selected them, because we wanted these exceptional people that had face validity. I don't know if you have to be a visionary leader to be able to play this way, but they all were. And I'm not saying that vision doesn't matter, because vision does matter. And it's very, very important when you're trying to lead change, and we'll come back to that. But that's not what they saw their role as being. Fundamentally, what they saw their role as being was creating the context in which other people could do the work that they needed to do, that they could collaborate, do discovery-driven learning, that they could actually do that kind of decision-making in a way that was more patient, as I mentioned before, and inclusive, and that they could really just work through the hard emotions associated with trying to do really innovative work. That's what they spent their time doing, not, I'm the visionary, follow me. So one of the things that Bill said to me is, I stopped reading books on leadership, Linda, because they say I'm supposed to have a vision. By definition, if you're trying to do something breakthrough, you have no vision. Isn't that right? So I guess I don't lead. I'm thinking like, okay, that's semantics. And it isn't, actually. A number of them said to me, there's no vision associated with breakthrough leadership. Is there, Linda? I mean, I am working with some people who are like trying to go to Mars, too, because I still have those, that side of me. I'm not going to Mars with them, but I'm enjoying, I keep telling them that. I'm not going. I just want to know how you're going to get there. But anyway, don't make me go. But one of the things that I would say is that they all begin to say to me, well, we don't know. That's not the game. The whole point is we come to work because we don't know. We don't have the vision. But they were all visionary. I just want to say that. And they do have points of view. That is a piece of this puzzle. But really, it's about how do we create the context in which people will be willing and able to do the work that they need to do. And what I've been mostly describing to you is the able part of it, what they thought about. But what makes them willing goes to the culture. And that's the other part of the story. But before I turn to the culture piece, just to put it into context, one of the things that we tried to do and to connect these pieces of the puzzle together is that what you're doing when you're trying to innovate and what's happening with these capabilities, and I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but we can if you have questions about it later, is when you're on this side as a leader, if you look at your behavior as a leader, when you're on this side of these things, you are unleashing people's talents and passions. So one of my colleagues, Amy Edmondson, talks about psychological safety. Basically, you're creating a context, in part, there are other things happening here, where people will have the psychological safety to share what their talents and passions are with you. When you're on this side, you're getting the useful. You're harnessing or leveraging those resources. So I see Robin came in, and Robin in her work on diversity talks about this too. This side is about amplifying differences in the diversity you have. But once you amplify them, you don't want to have chaos as you're trying to leverage it and make it useful, but you're going to have some conflict, and you may have some chaos for a while, who knows. But what we need is we need leaders who are actually comfortable moving along these dimensions depending on what the organization needs at a given time. Do I need to be unleashing, or is it time to harness? So one of the things that all of the leaders told us, and you all know this, innovation rarely happens unless people have constraints. Right? So you got to tell them at some point, it's urgent, we need the website. You have performance, you got a budget, whatever it is. It's not like it's open and free. This is the side that says this is what the organization needs. And so I, as a leader, going back to what's happening, I need to make sure where we need to be. Now, the other piece of this that I will tell you, this comes from looking at people's behaviors, but the first two are about creative abrasion, the second two are about agility, and the last two are about resolution, just to tell you. So when you go to look at and understand why your organization maybe doesn't have enough creative abrasion or what's going on with resolution, you can go back to look at the behaviors and the preferences of the leaders and maybe help you understand in terms of their own behavior why they haven't created an organization that actually has a certain capability that you really need for innovation. So that's part of how the leadership and what their style and behavior is and how it relates to, and their mindset to whether or not they're able to innovate. But the culture is really the foundation that allows for these capabilities to operate. And I don't want to walk through each and every piece of the culture piece, but this is what makes an organization willing. And we ended up calling it a community culture. And the reason why we called it a community culture is that people felt very connected. They felt very much a sense of belonging and meaning about the work that they were doing. And so the word community actually captured that for us. But what we saw is in every organization, the foundation was there was a sense of purpose. They didn't focus on vision. As leaders, they focused on why we're together, why we exist, what's the meaning of the work. And there were shared values, some common values. Each organization obviously had its own culture, but there were some values we saw that they all had in common. And there were some norms or rules of engagement. And one of the things that I want to say, going back to what these leaders were really focusing on, is, and I am a protege, literally, of John Kotter and Warren Bennis. I've had the privilege of working with both men who taught me about the importance of the distinction between leadership and management. So I was horrified to discover that leading innovation didn't seem to be about, if you will, coming up with a vision, communicating it, and inspiring people to fulfill that vision. That's what I had learned about how you thought about leadership. That's about leading change. That is not about leading innovation. So what the leaders told me is one thing is that innovation is a voluntary act. You cannot force someone to innovate. Your formal authority has nothing to do with, it's voluntary. You cannot make someone innovate. Everybody agree with that? They have to volunteer to do it, which is why the purpose of the work has to speak to them. It's not worth it to me unless it speaks to me personally to do it. The second thing is, as one of them said to me, Linda, if I told people, the people I work with, I have a vision, follow me, they would go work somewhere else. They are not interested in following me into the future. They are interested in co-creating the future with me. It's a co-creation process. So I am working on, if you will, creating the capabilities that will allow us to co-create together and the culture that will allow us to co-create together. It's not followership. That's not the game. Now, the leaders that we studied, and I will talk about some that had to change their organizations, transform them into being more innovative, classic leadership in the way that John and Warren talked to us about it, classic. But at the end of it, they wanted to exercise a different kind of leadership, the mindset that they were trying to put in place. So the culture piece, just to say a few parts about this, I don't think, this is Mrs. Kim. Mrs. Kim, I don't know if any of you would know Mrs. Kim. She is the woman who brought luxury brands to Korea years ago. One of the brands that she now owns, she didn't always own it, is MCM. And MCM at one point in Europe was a very, very popular luxury brand, probably as popular as Louis Vuitton, lost its way, but it never lost its way in parts of Asia because Mrs. Kim owned the license. Mrs. Kim is also involved with the UN Women's, with a lot of activities in the UN and with women, et cetera. She's a Christian. And I'm saying this because that's the first thing she would tell you about her. So Mrs. Kim is the first person when I went to visit her. She said, we have a Harvard professor here. She is going to lead us in prayer. It's like, okay, all right. What kind of prayer does a Harvard Business School professor do? So anyway, Mrs. Kim and I, and there we were. And the other thing is she has a prayer group on the Bund in China. Her company was very worried. She is deeply Christian. Why did she get into the luxury business? Because it's how women begin to define themselves. It goes to their identity. And she was very worried that there was not an Asian woman in that business helping Asian women define who they wanted to be or who they want to be. And what worried her was that you had a lot of Western companies who were going to tell these women who they should be. And her worry, these are her words, not mine, is that they were being taught to be concubines. And she wanted no parts of that. She wanted to have a luxury brand that helped women feel empowered and free. So years and years ago, she had luxury backpacks. They're now very popular. Mrs. Kim had those 10 years ago, right? Because you have your hands free. So Mrs. Kim, now she's working with men and doesn't want them just to wear black. She wants some individuality happening in China. So for her, it's always back to issues of identity. Very deep in what she's, and when you meet the Brits and the other people who work with her, they first join because they're interested in being with someone who knows how to build brands. Mrs. Kim knows how to build brands. But they then say, this whole business about, it's a women's identity, this actually matters. It's affecting how we're making decisions, who we're getting to make our products, who we're choosing to advertise our products, how we're thinking about the pricing. So that's the purpose of the work. And that's what animates what she's doing. And it's very clear if you go to her organization, that's the story. She hires lots of divorced women, because particularly divorced women in Korea are almost non-entity. She has them working in her company. She has men as well, but there's lots about what she does that reflects this. So that's the purpose of the work. And the purpose really is important. Now, it turns out I find myself talking about this work with many companies that are trying to deal with their, quote, millennials, because millennials care about purpose. And it does turn out that these organizations are very purpose-driven. That is a piece of the story. And that's what makes people willing to do it. These are the values. These are easy words to say. I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. But the thing about bold ambition, and we were never really completely comfortable with that, is that all of these organizations have appetites that are much bigger than their current capabilities. They're very much stretch kinds of organizations in what they're trying to get done. This is the rules of engagement. These will not surprise you, easy words again, but let me tell you what they mean. Respect here means that you believe that everybody has a slice of genius. Now, one of the challenges is that when you're trying to select leaders, not all leaders believe that everybody has a slice of genius. So when people ask me who can't learn to lead this way, sometimes I wonder, well, if you don't believe that, it's going to be pretty tricky to have sort of a democracy about it. Again, not that you, and this is a very fundamental belief. Now, Nelson Mandela believed that no one was ordinary, right? Really very interesting to think about. That's the mindset. Trust is that you basically assume that everyone is well-intended. Even if you don't, you have to act like, and if you don't act like people are well-intended, the leader might speak up and tell you, excuse me, you're acting as if there's a hidden agenda here. Imagine the energy that's released when you can assume that people are well-intended. The final one, this issue of influence, the idea that the minority voice must be heard. Doesn't mean you do what the minority voice says, but you must hear it. So if the minority voice doesn't speak up, the leader will say, excuse me, don't talk about this outside of the meeting. You didn't bring it up in the meeting. We need to know. Or if the minority voice speaks up and people ignore it, the leader will say, are you listening to what so-and-so had to say? I think he or she has a different point of view. So that would be, they do intervene. Mostly these leaders intervene a lot about culture. If you're violating, if you will, the culture of what you're supposed to do. Now, when we first looked at this research, we saw the norms about, and this is everyone's opinion matters. As I said, not everybody believes that. Again, everyone's opinion doesn't get weighted the same way. I want to be real clear about that. But everyone has a right to have an opinion and should have one. If you make a mistake, it's not held against you. And I will tell you a story to try to pull this together. But the thing that we didn't see until we went back through the data is there were also norms about how we're supposed to think together, not just norms about how we're supposed to interact with each other. And these are very important, we think, for why these organizations are able to deal with diversity. Because even though we have different points of view, if we have some rules about how we're supposed to think together, I can hold you accountable. It goes back to the standards again. So one of the rules is that you're supposed to see the whole. You're not just supposed to think about your piece, and if you're not thinking about how it relates to the other parts of the puzzle or the people, then someone can ask you about that. You also can question anything. And the final one is you have to have data. And this is not the best label for it, but we couldn't think of a better label. If you don't have data or you, quote, have no evidence, you can simply say, I have no evidence except for my gut, right? But just say it. You know how people act like they have evidence when they don't? It's just, okay, you can say I have no, and then we'll say, okay, how do we do the experiment so we get the evidence? Or what do we need to do to know, right? So these are rules that, again, help us together problem solve and kind of help keep us honest about how we're thinking about things. And actually, one of the companies we were studying actually began to help individuals learn how to do more critical thinking and advocacy for their points of view. Because not only do you want people to learn how to actively listen and inquire, you want them to learn how to advocate properly so that you have a true marketplace of ideas, right? So we didn't see these first, but they're actually, I think they're quite critical to have in place for you to be able to do the kind of problem solving we see. Now, I want to tell you two things. One is, when you create this culture, you do get alignment. Because I begin to worry is if you don't have a vision, how do you get people aligned? Well, the purpose and the values and the norms got to kind of get us moving together in the same way as vision would, in some ways. There is an alignment that comes from that sense of purpose. And I just want to, before I turn to Luca, let me just quickly give you, I'm looking at the time because I want to make sure to be able to tell you about two other people. Yeah, let me just tell you this now. So Greg doesn't particularly care for this story, but he tells it himself, so I'm happy to tell you. This is my co-author from Pixar, so since he tells it, I'll tell it. So, and this is maybe something that some of you are thinking. This is all well and good, but you know about Steve Jobs, and you read about Steve Jobs, and this doesn't seem to fit how you think about Steve Jobs and how. And I don't know Apple. I know the Apple stores in Asia because one of my former students developed them, and I saw those, et cetera, but I don't know Apple otherwise. But there are two people that I work with very closely who probably know Steve Jobs better than anyone else in the world. That's what other people tell me. One is Ed, who you've seen, and Ed's written his own chapter about Steve and thinking of writing more because he doesn't think people completely get the man. And the other is the man who launched every one of the Apple products and also designed the Apple Store, Tim. He has a firm called 8. He's another person that I work with and know pretty well. So they both would agree that the picture we have of Steve is not completely as broad as it should be. So let me tell you the story about Greg to illustrate this. So Greg was, as I said, the chief technology officer of Pixar. And one of the things he was to make sure of is they never lost any data. Because the data, obviously the movie only exists in the computer. That's hard to remember, actually. Even when you're there looking at Ratatouille and the rat, he doesn't exist, he's only in that computer. So anyhow, they were doing Toy Story, and they ended up, I think it was Toy Story 2, they ended up losing the data. So they had 5 systems to make sure that they never lost data, because we all have redundant systems, right? And they somehow had a perfect storm and the movie got lost. That's shocking, not good, right? So if you had to go tell Steve Jobs you have lost Toy Story 2, given what you've read about him, this would not be something you'd be looking forward to doing, right? So they had, and of course, that's the least of it. He's devastated. They're horrified. How could this have happened? He went to MIT. They're all what's happening here? So they go to tell him. And Greg has told his wife there's going to be a resignation, I'm going to have to resign, the whole thing. They go to tell him, and apparently his first reaction was, if you've lost this movie, this must be really, really hard to do. This must be really, really hard because you're really, really smart. I don't suffer fools. Everybody we have is good. We had no idea that this was that hard. Now, before you could say anything else, they were able to say, guess what, we found it. Now, how did they find it? And some of you may know this. The reason they found it was because they had made a decision a few months earlier to spend $90,000 to get a computer to allow a woman who was on maternity leave to work on the movie from home. She was so disappointed. She was so committed. She really, really wanted to still work on it. Now, she was so busy with her baby, she didn't notice they'd lost the movie, right? But then she realized that there was panic happening. She said, oh, you all forgot I have a copy. So they sent over an armored truck to bring that copy of the movie back, right? And that is how the whole studio was saved. Now, what they say about this story is it takes a village. So if you actually look at the credits of a Pixar movie, and have any of you noticed, the last credits are the names of all babies born during a production. Now you know why. And when they figured out, literally, and this goes to the culture of the organization, because if you know anything about most movies, very few people see a movie as it's being made. It certainly does not leave the campus, right? That's not what goes on. And they have deep trust. And people said to Ed, well, how could you do that? What would she give it to? He said, who's she going to give it to? It's ours. That sense of responsibility, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard, that she would give that movie to someone. The big decision with us is we didn't have $90,000, really. But thank goodness we understand she's a part of the community. She wants to be, and she wasn't like the big person, she was not a lead person or something, but she wanted to be included. And it was important, symbolically, that people knew that everyone was playing. So then they decided who's going to get a bonus. Someone decided we should give bonuses. They had a lot of problems with Toy Story 2. And he said, we're never going to give bonuses just to the people who made the movie. If we're going to give bonuses, everyone in the whole studio gets a bonus. So we're going to figure out how much money we have, and everyone's going to get, I believe it was 13 times 1 week's salary. And everybody got, now obviously the director makes a lot more money than the person who moves boxes, but they all got 13 times. And they stood in the front of the studio and handed each person a check. So just to give you a feel for the culture of the place. Now that failure was not what is referred to as a praiseworthy failure. That was a blameworthy failure, right? And they did a post-mortem to find out what went wrong. It turned out there was only one human error. And when you took the tape off before you checked that it had been on, you're supposed to do that last thing before you pull the tape. Otherwise, they all thought about, the way they thought about doing this was wrong. So they called all the banks in New York and everybody else and said, there is a flaw in our thinking about how you make sure you don't lose data. Because we only had one human error, and that's a problem. That gives you a feel for the culture of the place, and those are my stories, in part about how Steve Jobs understood completely this was a collective activity and the role of the community, and that you're going to have missteps and failures when you're actually trying to innovate, and you've got to do your homework. Now, we then looked at organizations that were not innovative, that needed to become innovative. And this is a controversial story, which is why I do want to tell it to you. Because this man, we met him when he was at Fiat, actually Luca, and he was the person responsible for rejuvenating the Fiat 500. Then he left Fiat and went to Volkswagen. And he became the chief marketing officer of all 9 brands of Volkswagen, and the marketing, at the same time, was the head of marketing for the Volkswagen brand. And then he became the head of sales and marketing for Audi. Now, my first book that I wrote, I was desperately upset because the companies would not allow me to say who they were. And that ended up making the book feel timeless. So I'm glad you don't know who they were. This one, I have Volkswagen, okay? And we know that there's controversy about Volkswagen, so I just want to be clear. And he is not implicated legally in any of what has happened from everything I see and everything I've been hearing about and following it. And Luca, though, when he went to, he's an Italian, and he learned German. That was the first thing he did when he decided, because German is the official language of Volkswagen. And when he went over to there, he discovered that they did not have a democracy of innovation, that the only people at Volkswagen who can innovate are design engineers. And when he went to Audi in particular, he said, well, how can you have an innovative brand if only the engineers, the design engineers are innovative? A brand is built from the inside out. So unless we're all innovative, it won't be an innovative brand. So his task was to convince the marketing and sales people that they could innovate, which was very, very difficult. And so he gave them a series of positive shocks. And this is a strategy meeting. Now, this may not look like a positive shock to you, but many of our leaders did use space as a way of shocking people, pushing people together. The marketing team for Volkswagen had never met in one place. He used a large percentage of his budget to have them come meet. He is a marketeer. There he is, being in the middle there. But so he did it next to the Brandenburg Gate. Change, right? Transformation. And he told them there would be no place for your PowerPoint. They did not believe him. So they brought their PowerPoint, but as you can see, there is no place to put up your PowerPoint about what you're doing. Instead, they have no chairs, or very few chairs. These people, to say this was a positive shock would be a polite way of putting it. They were ready to absolutely kill this Italian man who's appeared in their presence. But one of the things he wanted them to do is to have to write their strategies on these boards and then push them together. And then people could erase one of your points of your strategy, right? It's not on the PowerPoint where it's stuck. You've got to collaborate across, and I can erase this and put my words on your board, etc. They weren't happy when people wrote on their boards. But anyway, this was an example just to show you of the shock he had to give them to change the way they were working. There's lots more about this that I could say about the change, but I just want to give you a sense that physically these people felt like, whoa. Now, the other thing that he was known for, that he did years before that he brought there, is he already was designing cars with the customer in the process. That's partly how they did the Fiat 500. And one of the tasks that he created for them, because he had to push them, was they did a global launch of a car in 3 different countries at the same time, which apparently all companies don't do that. They do each one separately. But they had to do China, Germany, and the US all on the same day. So to do that, the only way they could get it done was to completely rework their process. New and useful processes, right? He announced it publicly. They thought he was insane. And they moved to this, and he is the first non-German on the board of Volkswagen now, actually, because he was able to move them. Now, this is the man who most inspires me, and I actually, in some ways, I guess he does most inspire me. This is Vineet. And Vineet is the head of was the CEO of a company called HCL Technologies. And HCL was the company that actually kind of created the computer industry in India. Literally, I guess people would say that. But by the time we met them, they were number 5. And as he said, when you're an outsourcer and you're number 5, you're about to become irrelevant, because who recommends number 6, right? Problem, they were growing at 35%, however, even though they were number 5. So one of the things we all have to keep in our companies focused on the external view, they weren't growing as fast as their competitors. That's the dilemma here. So he needed to do something very dramatic, and he was considered to be at the time a very young CEO in India, because I think he was in the early 40s. And he told the founder, who was still left in the company, you have to let me do it my way. Now Shiv Shiv agreed to that, but not really, obviously. But he did a lot of managing up. But I'm going to use his words. So Vineet introduced me to his young sparks. This is his workforce. He doesn't have who's at Pixar. He doesn't have who's at Google. He doesn't have who's at Volkswagen. They're not the number 1 company, so they're not getting the top graduates, because the top graduates go to the number 1 companies, right? So this is his group, his young sparks. And he said, we need to turn over the growth of the company to these young people, because we have a young demographic in India, and these are the people that are going to create value for us or not. And when he said this, he said, Linda, what you need to understand about India is no one is really well educated. It's a bit of an extreme statement. He is a provocateur. I just want to tell you that. But he said, no one's really well educated because it's just the nature of our education. He's no longer the CEO, and he's doing education reform. So he really has been very consistent in his belief about issues about their education system. But he said the most important thing, Linda, is even if you go to the best school, how do you get an A? Let me tell you how you get an A if you're in India. The teacher dictates and you repeat. The student who repeats exactly what the teacher said gets the A. This does not lead to innovative thinking. This does not lead to knowing how to make judgment calls. This is why India will never, ever be able to compete if we don't break. I'm not just trying to change our company culture. I'm actually getting at our national culture, how people are educated. Interestingly enough, I was asked to take him with me to Singapore to go talk to people there about their education system. So he said, if you go to school and you learn that the way you get an A is to repeat what the teacher tells you, when you go to work in a company and you become a manager, you see your job as you dictate and make sure no one deviates. That will not allow us to compete with the West. We could use some more discipline and some dictating, right, anyway. But anyhow, that will not allow us to. It's a big problem for the whole country. He said the other problem is if you're a follower, and when you're the follower or you're the young spark, you think you're not supposed to deviate. We can't compete unless we do something about this mindset of both parties. So he is a provocateur, and he went to these young sparks. He said, who do you want to be? This is actually their picture. And they came up with this. The young sparks, they had a series of meetings, and they said this is who they want to be. Then he did with them what he referred to as mirror, mirror. Are you this? No. Right? You aren't. So, how do we transform this company so you can be that? Because that's who you want to be, going back to their passion. And they worked on that. And he did something that he called, this is also one of their pictures, reversing the pyramid. That basically, he said, we're going to loosen the stranglehold of the few, the managers, to allow the power of the many to be emerged. So you as the manager, you're the enabler of the people above you because value is created at the front line in an outsourcing company. Many, many people left the company because they didn't want to be this. Right? Excuse me, I'm losing power, all kinds. Both managers and individuals who, the individual contributors, because they weren't comfortable with this, just to be clear. But he laid out a process in a very, John Cotter, Warren Bennis way. And after 5 years, this is where they are. And what this is about is he said, what we need to do, this is a front line, this is a 20-something, who came up with the $15 million cost savings for a client. And the way they did, and this was about this big culture change and all that he worked on to create the kind of culture and capabilities we described, and putting in processes to allow this to happen. And what he said is, if you think about the language I said to you before, he said, you know what? We can have no performance gaps. We have to deliver what we said we would in the contract, right? Of course, we'd all be happy if our outsourcers would do that, right? But we have to do that. That's the minimal. But if we want to delight them, to really be able to be sticky and not have our margins squeezed, we must do something between the shoulds and the coulds. We must go beyond the contract. And that's what they call it, going beyond the contract. Game changers, that would be my language for it. And when you go beyond, this is going beyond the contract. So the whole organization was set up so that we all know in our own way. Now, most of the people are not creating $15 million ideas, but many more of them are than you think because of how they've done this. So no one would have believed that these people had this kind of potential. They do. Now, one of the things that's happened, and this is how they educate. He's teaching them how to do this stuff. So if you come up with $1 million idea, you get to be a superhero. And you have your own comic book or graphic novel, as my son calls them. And this is how you tell your story in a way that can be shared with everyone about what it took to do this. And this is an education process. And one of the things that the leaders, that other CEOs said to him, also when we were in Singapore, well, how can you afford to invest in these people given how mobile they are? And what did he say? The problem is not if you invest in them and they move. The problem is if you don't invest in them and they stay. Right? Yeah. So he said, this is an easy call, given what it takes to be competitive today. So in using these principles that I'm describing to you and trying to create this kind of culture and capability, he now is getting this kind of work. He's no longer the CEO. But let me show you, this is where they were. I can only compare them to other Indian companies because of the way the data. My colleague who studies this industry told me that we can't do it across US companies and Indian companies for reasons I don't quite get. But anyhow, you can see how they were in the doghouse. They're the red line. And you can see where they are now. We'll have to continue to see what's happening now because all of these companies are going through another set of challenges with the cloud and AI, et cetera. But you can see how much improvement, if you will, they made in productivity because they were truly about to become irrelevant, as he described it, even though they were growing at 35%. And these are the kinds of results. And this is a big company. They now actually, it's like 90,000 people, I think. So this is not a little, Pixar is relatively little. Google's, compared to what you might see with something like this outsources. It's a very big global company. It's not mining. It's obviously, again, it's a different kind of workforce than some of the others that we're seeing. This is the last leader, I think, that I'm going to talk with you about. This is Tom in his favorite picture outside the White House. Tom was the head of, he's called the Deputy Director of Technology and Innovation. That's his actual title under the Obama administration. And I received a call from John Seely Brown. Do many of you know who John Seely Brown is? He was the man who created Xerox PARC, where the graphic user interface, and a group of technologists called me and said, Linda, there's a leader we'd like for you to go study. because I know you're trying to study leaders. This man, in our mind, is exceptional at building ecosystems to innovate. And apparently he worked, well, not apparently, he did work for, under the Clinton administration, he was more of an individual contributor. And he was seen as being a person who played a very serious role in the creation of nanotechnology, catalyzing the ecosystem required to get nanotechnology going on. And now one of the things he's working on, and he would never claim to be the starter of it, et cetera, a catalyst kind of person, is the BRAIN Initiative, which is about bringing nanotechnology and biotechnology together, in part because now we have those technologies, we can understand the brain in different ways. But anyway, he's just felt, this group of technologists called me and said, would you go study him? We think he's one of these people that we need to understand what it is he's doing because he's making a difference. And they also told me that we already got your clearance from the White, you're cleared. I'm glad they did that. And we weren't going to call you until we knew you were allowed to go into the White House. So we had the privilege of studying him for a couple of years. And he's one of the people we recently studied. But to describe and thinking about the development task with regard to the leaders here, just to remind us. So, Michael Tushman, Charles O'Reilly, Clay Christensen talk about this idea structurally of having one part of your business that is working on your current strategy and exploiting it, and another part of your business that is exploring your new strategy. And the part that's exploring your new strategy may be an organic, something that you're growing internally, or it may be acquisitions. So many companies, and there's lots of research to tell us that structurally, you might want to create these ambidextrous organizations where you have these two parts that are doing these things, because to try to do them all in one is too complicated for all the reasons we can imagine or that you all know all too well. So what Tom thought about, this is my putting language on this, is he needed to create that middle group, the group that connects the present and the future. Because he only had a budget to bring about 10 to 15 people into government, a team, to catalyze innovation relative to the administration's priorities. They had a whole series of priorities that they wanted, and he needed to create a team to do that. And I really found him fascinating because he did understand that you needed that middle group. Because I think what we often see, because some of the people we've studied, they're in that new group, but guess what? They can never integrate it back into the exploit piece so that they can scale it. Right? It's just always out there, separate. And he was like, how do I create a team that can play this role, that connects, that's enough connected to the institution of government or whatever it is we're trying to change, and to all these worlds out there, those people working on the future stuff, and we're going to be the team that brings them together. And I think this is a thing that we don't pay enough attention to when we're trying to develop our leaders in our companies who have to be able to lead innovation. So the piece of the puzzle that he worked very hard on creating they're the connector group. And what I wanted to show you is how he spent his time. And Tom spends 40% of his time on either 10% hiring the right people and 30% really helping develop them so that they actually can play that connector role, which is a very, very complicated role for people to play in an organization. Nonetheless, something like the government, I mean, if you just sort of imagine all the kinds of things there. So he wanted to create what he referred to as policy entrepreneurs, a team of policy entrepreneurs. And I just want to talk through a couple things he said. One is he said he wanted people who were T-shaped, very deep about something broad enough across the top that that expertise could be utilized, that they could be those connectors. Also, he wanted them to have their own moonshots. He kind of grew up with JFK. He has the moonshot language, but it had to tie to their passions. So he was somewhat opportunistic about who he hired, because, or what they worked on, because it had to fit what they found meaningful, purpose that they cared about. And he really tried to help them learn to be, quote, intentional, but think very long term. Like nanotechnology took a long time to get it done, but they had to learn how to build these coalitions. So what I would say, one of the things, just thinking about the development piece, I don't want to read all of these to you, but I just want to talk about them. What he used to do is he used to tell them to do what he called, and maybe someone else even uses this language, the magic laptop. He would have them get their laptop out and write a headline. And that headline would be what they would have accomplished. So as you saw, these were people who came in for short terms of duty. You didn't have to stay. He wasn't trying to say you had to be a government. Just come do whatever it is tied to your passion that aligns with what we're trying to work on. And what he'd say is, on that laptop, write the headline of what you've accomplished. And then we're going to work backwards. This is about being intentional. How do you get there? So the first thing he would say to them, okay, who did you talk to and what did you ask them for? Very specifically. This is not like, okay, what did you do since you got there? Who are you going to talk to? And then he would he had these different sayings. They called them Khalil-isms. So one of the things I would encourage you to talk to your leaders about is, what are your Khalil-isms? What are your Hill-isms, or whatever it is that people have learned from you about how they're supposed to go about working as these connectors? And so, light a single candle. What that was about is they often wanted to go to the most powerful person who could really be influential and get done what they wanted to get done. Don't go to the most powerful necessarily. Start with the person who's interested. Right? Get it done. The kernel, pop in the corn. Pop, just make sure think that way. Make it easy for them. Do not simply advocate. One of my colleagues that I get to write with a lot is a man named Doug Reddy. Some of you may know Doug. Doug wrote an article about enterprise leaders. The problem is we always teach people how to be advocacy-oriented builders and not integrated-oriented brokers, right? He's like, you're brokers, you're not builders, simply, right? So what you need to do is make it easy for the person to do what you want. So start with their pain point, not your pain point. Figure out where, and pivot if necessary, just like entrepreneurs do, just so you can move and you'll get where you're going to go. And, always have it be actionable. Never worry about taking credit. Very basic stuff. So when you're thinking about the leaders you're developing or who you have in place, what were their teams described? They actually had a list of Khalil-isms up on the wall that they could refer to, and sometimes they would hold themselves accountable because they weren't behaving consistently with this. And these are people who are extremely driven, as you might imagine, right? And who are like, want to build, want to get it done, very impatient, all of these things. And this man was helping them develop the mindset necessary to get this work done. And so the other book that we were working on at the same time as we were working on Collective Genius was we were working on a book that ended up being called Being the Boss. And the reason why was because, for me personally, when it turned out that leading innovation was not about what I had learned about leadership, we had to have another way of conceiving of leadership. And this is very simplistic. The first is it's about managing yourself. Leadership is always about using yourself as an instrument to get things done, and you're trying to match your intent with your impact. So one piece here is, what is your mindset about leadership? If it's about innovation, it needs to be more this mindset than the visionary one. And as one of my MBAs said to me, after he graduated, you didn't teach me to be a stage setter. I learned to be a visionary. Well, you're setting the stage for other people now. I'm teaching you something else. Keep growing. Lifelong learning. Okay, next one. Manage your network. The next piece of the puzzle is, it really is, particularly with innovation, you have to be able to deal with those people over whom you have no formal authority, but you're deeply dependent on to get your job done. This is so critical because most innovation happens. It have to have the diversity, the different perspectives, work horizontally across the organization. We do not spend enough time helping people learn how to manage the network. Tom got that in spades in terms of trying to develop these entrepreneurs and figuring out what to spend time with them on. And the final one is managing your team, which of course everyone's going to think about because you do think about the people who report to you. So we ended up having to reconceive leadership so that you could fit in, depending on what you're trying to lead. These are all going to be relevant, but how you sort of do it depends. But the part that I think we neglect too often is the network piece, particularly when it comes to the innovation part. So one is having the mindset about building the capabilities, building the culture for your team, but the other is working across and building a team of people around you who know how to be those connectors. And so, we talk about how do you build the networks that allow you to scan and sense. So Tom really you need to pay attention. Who are you talking to that really are influencing what you see as those gaps? How do you decide how to prioritize those performance gaps and those opportunity gaps? Are you prioritizing them in a way that fits what the organization really needs? You can only know that by building a network to sense and scan what's actually going on out there. The other piece is, can you build coalitions? If you're going to close those gaps, who do you need to connect to whom to get it done? And again, I don't think that most of us, and I want to apologize, I don't know you, spend enough time spending our time helping people develop this kind of notion of what they're doing and helping them understand how this is such a critical part of leadership nowadays. And then, of course, you want them to be brokers and bridgers, to be able them individually, and to build teams around them that know how to do this. Because often what happens is if I'm the leader, I'm going to be the liaison person. This is my job, maybe, right? But it's your whole team's job. If you have a whole team that knows how to operate this way, you're much more willing to take on opportunity gaps. If you don't have a team that's willing to do this, you're going to say, I know that opportunity is there, but we don't have the capacity to get it done. So it's a very important piece of the puzzle. And now this is Amy. She's the general counsel. She was the 3rd highest paid litigator in the world, which is not how she wants to be known, but this is a woman who's got a point of view, okay? She's a litigator. We studied her when she was a litigator, but then she ended up becoming the general counsel at a drug company, and she decided that she was going to create what some of you may have heard of, the Pfizer Legal Alliance. So Pfizer, which is controversial, 19 firms doing 75% of the work, being paid a fixed price, no billable hours. And what she wanted them to do is not simply coordinate, but to truly collaborate and become a community. And we actually have a whole description of how she did that. But one of the things that's most important about it is she role modeled herself, the behavior. And one of the things that people said about her, because she's a very decisive individual, very talented, right? That's what you'd be if you're a litigator. But she knew how to create space for other people. So she had the capacity, when she was putting together, you have to put in the right structure and governance, obviously, to get these people to work together. They got to feel like they're being paid to some extent fairly. But part of it, or not some extent, they want to work with Pfizer. She is the gorilla in the room. But she needed them to want to volunteer, to want to play this way. And one of the reasons she did this, she obviously needed to cut the costs of their legal fees, and she wanted them to do more innovative work. And interestingly enough, many of the lawyers ended up saying that they were finally doing the kind of work that they wanted to do as lawyers. That no more did they just have to, that she said, don't write me 5 pages when a paragraph will do, right? We're a team collectively. She put in place ways that they could share proprietary information so they could just get to the point and do what Pfizer needed to get done. But one of the things she did is even when she had a dinner party and invited the lawyers over to her home, she sat at the table with the kids, if you will. She's very aware of the symbolic piece of the collegialisms. Her teams had collegialisms too, about how you treat these other people so that they'll be okay to play. And one of the things she asked them to do was to actually create opportunity for women and minorities in their firms, because across the 19 firms, surely we can come up with the kinds of assignments that people need to truly develop the skills required to be a top lawyer and become a partner. So not only did they begin to address what Pfizer needed done, because they needed lots done, but also to develop a new kind of lawyer and a different mix demographically. Because if you wanted to be in this group of 19, you had to help with these efforts to create more minority and women partners in your firms as well. So it became an interesting experiment. So these are some of the personal qualities, and I'm going to skip through those. I now have talked at you more, and you all haven't asked me as many questions. But let me stop here and say, if you don't have as much innovation happening in your organization, do you have the capabilities? Is it something about your culture that's not in the right place? And I think, is it how people are thinking about leadership? Do they have a mindset that will allow for this co-creation process? Not simply, and are they developing game changers? Not simply people who are value creators, which again, very, very difficult to do, to be a value creator. Because what we see is that we just don't have enough people in that number 1 box. We don't have enough people throughout the organization who know how to be game changers. And we've been doing we actually are collecting data also about different ways companies are going about trying to create more people who can be these game changers as well. You all are very quiet. Is it because it's after lunch and it's dark out? Yes.
Earlier you made a very interesting point that you said for leading innovation, you don't need the vision, but you have to create the space. And you made the point that being a change leader is something very different. This Italian guy, you were describing a guy being a real change agent, totally changing. How do those two things fit together?
And also Vineet, and also I would say also Amy. All 3 of them were in change mode, right? So they did have a vision. They did talk about what that vision was. They did, try to communicate it very carefully. I think one of the things that we know is people have to act their way into being different. You just can't tell them intellectually, which is why Luca did things like create that space. give them a task they'd never done before, so the only way they could do it is by innovating, if you will. So they did both. And at the end, though, but fundamentally, even with Vineet, this is a teeny thing in some ways, he created something called You and I, where people could write into him and he would give them feedback. You know, they could ask him questions and he would answer. In India, that's very unusual to have that closeness. And what he realized is that he was feeding this idea that he had all the answers, so he stopped doing You and I. Every other week he did My Problems, where he said, these are my problems. These are the things I couldn't figure out this week. Any thoughts? And the first time it happened, they were like, what? What do you mean you have problems? You don't know the answers? He said, well, don't know, right? Because he was trying to change the mindset of where the answers were going to come from, and he had fallen into it himself in his own way, right? So what happened with Volkswagen example, the team couldn't do it. They didn't know what to do about this global launch. And one of the things that they asked for a leader, because he put together a team of peers, cross-functional, to get this done. They didn't understand what was supposed to happen at all. So they asked for a leader, and after a while he said, okay, we're going to give them a leader, because he wanted to see who would emerge. Apparently the Italians and Fiat just got themselves organized, found a leader, and did it. This did not happen in Volkswagen. They're much more structured. So the leader he gave them was one of their peers. They were shocked. He did not assign someone who was, senior. He basically took a peer who was good at working with senior management, if you will, and made that person the leader. So they got a leader, but not the one they expected. So what they all did is they made them behave in different kinds of contexts, different kinds of ways. Because, this obviously is not my boss, really, this person who's a leader. It's one of my peers, but he's just from a particular part of the business. So he tried to shift their interactions so that they would operate in a more collaborative way going forward. Not completely self-organized by any means. This is the leaders did step in. And actually, one of the things that Vineet said frequently was, I'm going to use brute force. If you noticed when I talked about those 6 paradoxes, I didn't go down all. One was bottom up versus top down. They were all very willing to be top down. It's not about being participative all the time. He'd say, brute force, not interested in your opinion, right? This is happening because this is what we need to get this thing moving to where we need to go, and you're taking too long. Right? Or the urgency or whatever it is. So I don't want to imply that they would act in terms of their behaviors along all that piece of the puzzle, given what they thought the organization needed to move where they needed to go. Yes?
Leading on from some of what you were saying there about different types of leaders, do you have different types of organizational structures that have got inbuilt barriers to some of this?
Yes.
I was thinking particularly that you said you looked at legal firms.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if professional services and partnerships
are more complicated?
Yes.
Yes, they are complicated. Just like why I didn't love being the leader of our, I think for 13 years I was our equivalent of our department chair. I remember the last 3 years I was begging the dean to let me out. I'm sure my colleagues were too. And he was like, no, you're not going now. Go back upstairs. But anyway, these individual contributors are complicated, right? So yes, we did look at we looked at a very extreme firm in one way. Do you know? I don't know if you know Pentagram. Pentagram, if you know, Pentagram is one of the world's leading design firms. They have 5 kinds of designers, from graphic artists to architects, etc. And they're one of the longest lasting design firms ever. And each of these designers, you have to be a rock star before you can join the firm. So it's interesting, why would a rock star join, right? I mean, they truly are. They create museums and things, right? Or graphic artists who do wonderful things. And they joined because they needed a graduate school. They needed creative abrasion. None of them felt that they could get done what they needed to get done. First off, they couldn't take on big enough projects unless they were with people, and they wanted to have impact. And they needed a team, a community of people to help them with that, and they understood that, and they also needed their ideas to be abraded. Because I'm so good in my own little space, I'm not getting better. But if I'm working with another person who's as good as I am in their own field, that's how I'm going to stay fresh and better. So they ended up creating, after much conversation, 2 values, equality and generosity. Those were the 2 values. So everybody, the junior and the senior partners, got paid the same. These people could all make their own money. I mean, do you all know the Academy of Sciences in California? The man who did the whole identity and everything. But these are, they do Harley Davidson Museum. They chose this because they needed the support of other really talented people to continue to raise their own game. And if you don't create that collective sense, of course, that's what they benefited from. So they worked really hard. But if over time you didn't make enough money to really help the firm out, they did make decisions that you could no longer be a part of the firm. So it was very, very tough stuff, and they all talked about it, and they all had rules about it. But yes, we did look at profession. We're looking at another, and Sanford Bernstein is the other. We're looking at a leader at Sanford Bernstein, which is a research analyst firm that does they have what they call a superstar model. So that's the other professional service firm we studied. Yes? Mm-hmm.
Your last point about the values links to my question,
Yes.
which is about the ethics of innovation.
Uh-huh.
The term that I haven't had today is disruption.
Yeah.
It's being thrown around a lot. There's sort of, in my world, sort of innovation on steroids.
Yes.
So the language of innovation is collaborative wisdom, it's creativity, it's problem solving.
Yes.
Disruption is survival.
Yeah, many of them are trying to survive, yeah.
It's about paradigm shift. It's very cruel, right?
Yes.
Uber, I think, is a very cruel model in a sense because it's going to disrupt massively things beyond their own control. So almost be careful what you innovate for because you have to also deal with the consequences of that. So where do the ethics of innovation be sit? Because I think in today's world you can innovate at the detriment of other key stakeholders on the planet, right? It's possible. You can do that. AI, nanotechnology, you mentioned that.
Yeah, in the sense of where's the ethics in these people's minds, or?
Yeah, in your research, I mean, have you come across people
ethics?
who think about it in that global context?
And what's happening? Well, some of these companies, I mean, obviously, to some extent, Google was quite a disruptor of a lot of, I mean, maybe in a different way. So we looked at many companies. Do they look at the ethics of it? Some of them do. Mrs. Kim certainly does. I mean, the sustainability, one of the things she's very concerned about, the materials being used to make a lot of the products. So some of them very explicitly, actually Vineet is very concerned. As I said, he's in the education space now. For him, it's a much bigger question that he was trying to address than just HCL. But he needs to make money and get HCL turned around. I don't know if it's like you call it a turnaround when you're growing at 35%, but he saw it as a turnaround because they were, going back to you said, you're number 5, you're growing at 35%, you're about to become irrelevant. He would say there is disruption happening and we need to innovate at a low cost point, right? That's the only way India is going to be able to survive. They're only going to play with us. So I think that the disruption is there. Interesting, the woman, I can't believe I'm blocking on her name, who created Zipcar. Do you all know she lives in the area here? Yeah, so she came to see me. We had a very interesting conversation because I guess she read Collective Genius. When you talk about the ethics of it, one of the things she talked with me about, I hope this is not inappropriate, it was a private conversation, but I guess this is all being called the sharing economy. And she's very concerned that who's sharing? Like, who's making the money from this? She's not so clear. The language worries her. And then she's obviously an example of one of the companies that gets put into that space. But if you look at who actually is getting rich from Uber or whatever it is, and whether people are getting working wages or something, that's something that we had a very interesting set of conversations about, and something that I'm looking at. The only one thing I can think of that might relate to what you're saying is this whole question of who, with the electric car. So one of the things that's happening in the auto industry is that people aren't going to drive cars at all. They're actually or very few cars. So what's our business going to be? Or even with electric cars, talking to the engineers who are designing those. Because I am looking at people are doing major disruption, as I said, even going to Mars or whatever it might be. But which doesn't feel real to me, but as I said, they're going. One of my former students was the commander of the International Space Station. He tells me, we're going. But he arranged for us to have class from outer space when he was on the space station. So I'm believing all of these things are possible now. It was hysterical. We had to do it at 8 at night because we had to be when he was on our side of the world, right? So, but the class was happy to stay late. But I would say that the one that I remember asking one of the people who are working on some of the, I guess basically robots to drive these cars, and I said, well, who decides, I'm not so smart, who decides what kind of accident you're going to have? Do you kill the most people? Who's coming up with the algorithms? And they said, we're not allowed to ask that question. Interestingly enough. I thought, oh, that's not our question to answer. We're just designing the capability. But one of the things, I was at an AI event recently of a consortium working on AI and virtual reality. So, and of different companies from different industries. And one of the things that I did ask is, who's developing the algorithms? Like, what's the diversity of the team that's coming up with these algorithms for whatever it is? Because those algorithms are only as good as the people who design the algorithms. And I don't know that there's a whole lot of diversity of the people who are thinking through what those algorithms should look like for any number of any number of activities for which they're being used. They're not real diverse teams. So I think these are all very legitimate questions. I don't know that I have deep insight into it. But many of the companies that we're working with are really very worried about disruption. I mean, there was a whole list there. I can't go through all of them. But they're really in danger of being disrupted, retailers, et cetera. So we're looking at, it's not released yet, but we're looking at a retailer in Asia that is truly trying to innovate in some big ways because they are definitely worried about disruption. And what's happening in China, they're working on supply chain and new products and a whole bunch of things. So, yeah,
I think
the ethics of it?
The moment computer engineers define social engineering,
Yeah.
and we don't address the gap, we're in a bit of a problem.
Yes, I can't say that I'm a specialist about that, but I have heard conversations, and I am participating in some of those, but I don't think people are thinking enough about who's creating those algorithms. I mean, seriously, that's my own bias when I look at, the other AI group we looked at was at IBM. IBM was we looked at one piece of IBM, and so a number of the people there were actually developing it's a long story, but fundamentally one of the pieces that some of the people we were working with were Watson Fellows, and are working on some of these kinds of issues, so it's not that I haven't had some conversations, but I'm not a specialist about those. I think they're very legitimate questions. Yep. Yes?
Is there such a thing as too much diversity?
Well, in many organizations, any diversity is too much because you don't know how to cope with it. And I mean that very seriously. So what we see with research is that when you look at diversity, usually it really works really well because you know how to embrace it and use it, or it's a disaster. And you'd be better off not having it. Seriously, it's very rare that diverse groups sort of are in the middle in terms of their performance. So I think unless you have leaders who are comfortable with amplifying diversity and working through that, you can get lots of the bad outcomes.
Leaders who would be able to use diversity
Yes.
wisely. Is there an optimum?
I don't know the answer to that. I've never studied it, so I wouldn't. I am an ethnographer. I do deeply believe that what I know. I could be wrong, but we have developed this instrument. In part, it was to do some more research so we could look at larger samples. But as I said, in some ways, these are things that I've been thinking about for a very, very long time, but we finally did some systematic research about it. And so I don't know the answer to that. Do you have a sense? I think most companies don't have enough as opposed to too much, but there could be too much, particularly if you don't know how to manage it. It does create the potential for conflict. Yes. Yeah, and one last thing about this, interesting, Mrs. Kim, the woman, she's in a context where people wouldn't even sit because she's the chairperson. They stand when they're with her. So guess where she started doing her conversations? Her serious conversations were held on airplanes where you had to sit and look her eye to eye, right? She said, I wait till we get on the airplane, sit next to him, then I ask him tough questions, and then it's a long ride from Korea to London. So use whatever tactic you need to get the conversation going. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks so much. Really a privilege to be here with you. Thank you.